Woo, terrain for Flatlanders. Does anyone here live in what you might be considered flatland? The Delta? Yep, okay, good. Well, you're in a good, safe space. Let's talk about this. So here's where I'm from, Lansing, Michigan. It's lower central Michigan. This is my house right here. Well, actually, that doesn't look right. Hold on a second. I accidentally had 40x vertical exaggeration turned on. Okay, here we go. This is Lansing, Michigan. True to its elevation scale, my house there. Why is it so flat? Goodness, you can even see the arc of the earth from this elevation. And, oh yeah, it's because 10,000 years ago, the last of the 1.5-mile thick bulldozers retreated from this location. So when it comes to mapping terrain and waxing on about hillshade and shaded relief, we tend to dive right into elevation models that look like this. So Switzerland gets the lion's share of the attention in all these beautiful mountainous locations, and that's where we pour our energy when it comes to terrain and relief representation. But in Michigan, this is what we call a mountain. These are the Porcupine Mountains in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They're gently rolling hills, but we call them mountains because it's what we've got. So similarly, this was my view looking out my window as a little boy from the north. This is me looking north. And likewise, this is me looking south. But as a kid, walking down that ditch was something, right? It's all proportional. All of mapping is relative. And scrabbling up that berm to get into the field to head to the river wasn't a small thing for me, right? That was real terrain for me. And I was going up and down that terrain. And coincidentally, I grew up in a town called Mount Pleasant. And if you look it up on Wikipedia, it's actually careful to note, like, hey, by the way, there are no mountains in this area. I don't know what they were thinking when they named it that. So rather than focusing on these big, gigantic, glorious, and majestic terrains, let's take a look at like more tender, more gentle, squishy and soft terrains like I'm used to. And I've got a two-step tango when it comes to adding terrain relief to super flat areas, because super flat areas deserve terrain as well. And the first step is dynamic range. So taking the full elevation within my view and just boxing it to what I'm seeing, the largest and the smallest elevation only within my view and not the whole data set. And then the second step in that dance is stretching that out visually using a standard deviation visualization scheme for that color gradient that we use for our shadows. Okay, I'll dig into this a little bit more specifically. So here we go. Here's a world map using our Global Terrain Elevation Service. It's actually really great. It covers the whole world, all the scales, zoom in, zoom out, and it'll give you an appropriate digital elevation model. And as you know, the whitest pixel on this map corresponds to the tip of Everest here, and all those black pixels correspond to sea level, and everything in between is shades of gray. But if we were to take a closer look at my home state of Michigan, and we zoom in, this is what we see in that range of elevation. You may or may not see exquisite geographic features in this view. And that's because we're only looking at a very narrow slice of the Earth's above sea level elevation that goes from black to white. What do? Well, we just use dynamic range, and we just peg white to the highest area within my view and black for the lowest area within my view. Dynamic range. And now all of a sudden we get some pretty interesting geographic features happening in the glorious mitten-shaped state of Michigan. Okay, so the second element is standard deviation. Here's a little river valley of area just to the west of where I live. And this is the default hillshade renderer for that same underlying elevation data source, sourced from Living Atlas, Esri's Living Atlas of the world. So this is the hillshade rendering of that elevation. And if I run a histogram on this, actually this is what I'm seeing. It's very gentle, pretty nuanced, but it's not classified. So we can force color gradation in here. So we'll just classify this using standard deviation. Here it is with 12 standard deviations. We're taking 12 statistical buckets from around the mean, and we're painting in areas of shade relative to those standard deviation distances. And it's a little bit more choppy, but we're increasing the contrast. And we can further increase the contrast by reducing the standard deviations in our hill shade rendering. So here's 6 standard deviations, 4 standard deviations, crying out loud, 2 standard deviations, it's getting pretty gnarly. Here's 1 standard deviation, and it's so high contrast and it's so ugly. But I'll tell you, there's a place for ugly hill shade, and I'm going to show you in a little bit what that is. So next I'm going to dive into some demos, and we'll start with ArcGIS Pro. So here I am in ArcGIS Pro. I'll zoom in to my childhood location there in Mount Pleasant, just west of town here, and this was my view growing up. You've seen it. And I'm going to turn on that hill shade that I have. You can see a little bit of interest here. This is actually at this scale derived from USGS 1-foot data, and I'm going to choose dynamic range, and I'll go standard deviation, and immediately I'm seeing some visual interest here. I mean, you can even see the pattern that Farmer Zion likes to plow his fields in that vertical orientation. Really amazing. You know, you see flood channels that are dry most of the time, but not all of the time. And this is pretty interesting. So let's keep going here. If I open up the blend modes and I choose overlay, I can bake those tones into my underlying imagery. And now I'm doing terrain-informed underlying imagery. I'm boosting the contrast of the imagery based on the underlying hill shade. And now I have a geographic sense of the terrain in this pretty flat area, but it's not actually super flat. You know, everything is relative. So let's see what we can do with the contrast here. If you want to smooth this out, you increase the number of standard deviations. Here's 4, 6 standard deviations, and the effect is diluted a little bit. We can go 1 standard deviation and just make it pop if we want to. So that's very stark. I'll go back to 2 standard deviations. And we'll take a little bit of a tour. We'll zoom out a little bit. And the incredibly flat area of Mount Pleasant reveals its underlying and interesting geographic terrain. It's all relative. We don't all live in mountains and amazing valleys, right? But it's still amazing, and it's still important to see the topographic relief of even flat places. So what about ArcGIS Online? Can we do this in ArcGIS Online? Let's fire up ArcGIS Online. Here I am in the map viewer. I'll zoom. I've heard Florida is pretty flat. Anyone here from Florida today? A lot of Floridians here. Is it flat there? Can you confirm that it's reasonably flat? Not a whole lot of mountains. So I'm going to pull in that same data set. This is the hill shade rendering of that elevation service, that global service, top down. And I can see a little bit of interesting stuff here, pot and kettle and some karst topography, but I really have to squint and do some wondering. So I'll select this, and I'll go into the style options. And of course, I'm going to choose standard deviation, and I'll choose that dynamic adjustment option. And immediately, I'm forcing the maximum amount of visual variability here. And then if I go into the visual properties for this, I can likewise apply an overlay blend mode. And now we have Florida, but Florida with some very obvious karst topography, right? The terrain of Florida is interesting and it's important. It doesn't happen to be mountainous, but that's okay. Similarly, this should look familiar to one of our previous presenters, right? What's more interesting than seeing the system of levees kind of reveal themselves via that technique? Is Hans here? Hans, are you here? Oh, okay. Well, this is the Netherlands. It turns out elevation is pretty important to folks in the Netherlands, and they don't have mountains and crazy valleys there. So it's this game of nuance. And so here's that same technique applied to the Netherlands before and after. I've heard Kansas is reasonably flat. Is this true? Can anyone confirm if Kansas is pretty flat? Okay, Jeremy Bartley, you're from Kansas, right? It's reasonably flat, right? But there's a lot of visual terrain interest. Look at this. Look what's going on in Kansas. There's a lot of activity happening geographically in Kansas. So I encourage you to show a little bit of love to the flat areas in your terrain mapping adventures. Here's another example, the Ganges River Delta. That's got to be insanely flat. But look, you can see the berms of the actual land mounds themselves. Now, aside from just being fair to people who live in flat areas, but why is this kind of thing important in addition to being fun? Well, it's important for visualizing things for flood mitigation and understanding where the water is going to go and where it won't go, that sort of thing. Erosion control, like you could see in my backyard as a little kid. You could see the flood channels, very obvious where the water would go when there is water. Environmental engineers would be very interested in this sort of visualization. Site suitability analysis, it's a great element for that sort of work. Hydrology, obviously, in wetland management. Recreation mapping. I'm not much of a jogger, but when I go up a very gentle incline, believe me, I feel it. And just for good old-fashioned handsomeness, right? It's a way to make your terrain pop a little bit. And I'm not the first person to do this, so I'm going to wrap this up with a couple of examples from some folks who've been doing this longer than I have. Marcel does beautiful work on Instagram. I don't know Marcel's technique, but the visual result is in the same sort of family, so definitely check out the work Marcel does. Also, Emery, I learned more recently, does it with some LiDAR data. If you're interested in learning other weird tips and tricks when it comes to mapping, I encourage you to check out this YouTube channel if you're so inclined and squandering your life away 1 minute at a time. So anyways, I leave you with, I implore you, give flat areas some love when it comes to terrain, right? All terrain is terrain. Thank you very much.